Hi, everyone, and welcome to Beyond the Basic Route. The focus of this webinar is looking at scheduling issues for complicated production scenarios. Brief introductions. My name is Carol Sikes. I'm a senior consultant at Argano in the Microsoft Tower. I've been in the Dynamics area for about 4.5, going on 5 years. I have been a member of the Atlanta area Dynamics user group, and I have several Microsoft certifications, most recently the Supply Chain Management Functional Expert certification that's been offered newly by Microsoft. My time in Dynamics has mostly been focused in the supply chain area, but specifically on production. A brief agenda, the 3 big scenarios we're going to look at. The first one is one that might be common to people already, but it's the idea that you can use multiple resource types if you needed to actually account for more than just one type of resource in your scheduling. Most commonly, being able to schedule for both a machine and a human resource. The next scenario is for scheduling with similar resources that have different capabilities. For example, if you had a number of different machines that you were using to do dies, but different machines could each run a different subset of those dies. So maybe machine A can handle dies 1 through 5, and machine B can handle dies 3 through 7. So there's some overlap in what they're capable of doing, but they're not identical, and you need to be able to schedule for that. And then the last scenario has to do with machine changeovers, the need that many people have when they have equipment that they actually have to change out pieces of the equipment in order to run different types of material, and you have to have the ability to try and minimize, frankly, the changeovers. And so you want to figure out a way to use the scheduling engine to minimize those changeovers and let D365 figure out, what that schedule should be. So first off, the primary and secondary resources. Again, this may be familiar to people that have been in the production area for some time. Secondary resources, you can use those to add additional capacity requirements. So if you needed to be able to schedule capacity for both machines and human resources, this is the most common use I've seen for primary and secondary resources, is the need to actually schedule the capacity for both. There are also different types of resources like tools, location, or facility that are options as a secondary resource. I just have not seen those leveraged as often. Typically, it's the machine and human. But it may not be an additional capacity requirement, but an additional cost component. I've also seen scenarios where people they had a cost that was associated with the machine itself, more similar to what we think of as an overhead cost, but directly attributed to the hours for that machine, as well as a cost for the human labor that was going to be operating the machine. And so they needed to reflect those differently. And so they had both a primary and secondary to handle that cost. But if in most cases where I've leveraged this, it's been a need to do the capacity piece, and often one or the other doesn't have the cost associated with it. So a reminder that you can leverage your route groups to control whether or not you're going to cost. You can also, if you were doing the second scenario where you needed costs for both types, but not capacity, you can account for that with the route group as well. So you can use your route groups to determine whether or not a particular type of resource is going to use cost or capacity. And lastly, whether or not it might have automatic consumption of any of the route, either the quantity or the time. And here's just a quick example of a primary and secondary resources. And so you're looking at the primary in the upper left, and we've got a primary that's the actual machine in this particular scenario. And you see that it's got a runtime and a process quantity, and the secondary is always going to inherit the runtime and the process quantity from the primary. One thing to note, if you had setup time and that you did not want that to count for the human resources that were going to be operating the machine, I have seen this before as well, where the primary resource used a route group that had setup and process time, whereas the secondary resource did not have setup time. And so in that scenario, the system won't schedule the setup time against the secondary resource. But Typically, they have the same times, and the secondary will inherit the time that's assigned to the primary. Next scenario has to do with different machines that have similar but not identical capabilities. And that's where we would want to leverage the D365 resource capabilities. The first thing to point out, if you're going to use resource capabilities and you're going to use the priority piece that is part of that, then you do have to account for that in your scheduling parameters. So either in the master planning module or in the organization administration module, you can go to your scheduling parameters, and there's this field, the primary resource selection field, that if you denote that as priority, then that the scheduling engine will consider the priorities that are assigned to the capabilities in against each resource in order to schedule properly. I mentioned earlier that one scenario might be where you had different machines that ran different dies and had different subsets that they could do. For this this webinar, and at the end, I'm actually going to go into D365 for a demonstration of all of these. So for this scenario, I've actually set up 6 mixer resources, and each of the resources is here on the screen, the 3101 through 3106 resources that are here on the screen. And there's 3 different capabilities, and they have to do with the weight that the mixer is capable of holding. Could have been a volume, but in this, I just chose to use a weight. So I've got a mix 250 capability, meaning that it can account up to 250 pounds, a mix 500, meaning it can account for up to 500 pounds, and a mix 1,000, so it can hold up to 1,000 pounds. So for this scenario, we're looking at the moment at the resources that I've assigned to the mix 250 capability. Well, since my 3105 and 3106 mixers can actually hold 1,000 pounds, certainly they can also handle 250. And the 3103 and 3104 can hold 500, so they can also hold 250. So they're all 6 showing here in this assignment of the resource capability. But I would want to schedule 2 my smaller mixers first and not take up my larger mixers for a 250 pound capability requirement if I can get it scheduled into my smaller mixers. And so that's why the priorities are the way they are. So the 2 priority 1 mixers are the smaller mixers. We would want to schedule anything that needed the mix 250 capacity to those first. And then if there's not enough capacity there, then it would look to these other mixers with the lower priorities. For the priority field, 1 is your highest, and then 2 would be next, and then 3. And the level field actually works slightly opposite. It's more like a minimum requirement. So in this scenario, I have what's going to basically be like a viscosity of the thing that's being mixed. I have a low, medium, and high. And so each of the mixers has different levels of viscosity they can handle, with a higher viscosity being something that would require a stronger mixer. And so a level 10 is going to be the low viscosity, level 20 is medium, and level 30 is high. So with the level field, if you identify that an item requires a certain level, then the resource has to have at or above that level in order to meet the expectation for the capability. So that's what we're showing here. These 6 resources, they're prioritized to try and run that lower mixer first in this particular group, and the levels are identifying the minimum capability for the viscosity variable that I had identified. And again, but that's for this scenario. You'd have to consider your own business scenario and what made the most sense. Neither of these is actually mandatory to use the capability functionality. It just adds to what the system is able to do when you use the capabilities for scheduling. When you go to assign this to an item, you do it through the route. And so going back, I've got 2 examples on the screen to show you what I was talking about. On the left is the route for the item that's identified as being 500 pounds and a low viscosity. And so we see that we have a resource group. So the resource group 31 contains all 6 of my mixers. In addition, I have a requirement for capability of mix 500. So I have to have up to 500 pounds as a capability to be able to handle this particular item. And then down at the bottom on the capabilities, so you do have to have the capability selected to have this minimum level needed at the bottom where the arrow is. When the capability is selected, you can add a minimum level. Since this is the low viscosity, the minimum level I need is 10. Moving over to the right-hand side, this is the route for the item that's specified as 1,000 pounds with high viscosity. So this needs the mix 1,000 capability. So it needs a mixer of up to 1,000 pounds. And again, it's that same resource group, but that different capability. When we go into the system at the end of the webinar, I'll show you on the previous slide, I showed you the mix 250 capabilities, which had all 6 resources in it. The mix 500 only has 4 resources, the 2 that are at 500 pounds and the 2 1,000s. And then the mix 1,000 only has the 2 resources that can handle 1,000 pounds assigned to that particular capability. So there's less resources that are able to meet this requirement of 1,000 pounds and also the minimum level of 30. So we'll take a look at that at the end, but that's how it's going to figure out how to schedule. Some other things to note. Earlier, I mentioned about the scheduling parameter. The other piece that needs to play into this, if you actually want to use it to help you schedule properly, is you'll need to have your resources identified for finite capacity. If things are set for infinite capacity, then it doesn't really do you that much good to use the capabilities to have the system figure out, especially with the priority piece, to figure out how it needs to schedule. So finite capacity should be set, and then also the scheduling parameter about priority. So those are both defaults. The finite capacity is set on the resource, and it can default in. And then the resource selection of being priority is set in your scheduling parameters, and that can default in. But just a reminder that when you run job scheduling, and you would want to run job scheduling because we are going to schedule to an individual resource out of our resource group. So we need to do job scheduling to be able to pick the individual resource. When we do that, we can actually change those parameters if we need to, but they will default in to the job scheduling form if we set them on the resource and in the scheduling parameter form. So that's what this screenshot is what it should look like when you run the job scheduling. So here's some results for some orders that I set up, and I realized it's very tiny print, so I'm going to try to talk you through. There were a set of orders for my 8 items of varying pounds and levels of viscosity that had different delivery dates. So actually down at the very bottom were the 2 1,000-pound items, and they are scheduled to the 1,000-pound mixers with the 2 different levels. And you can see the little diamond that represents the delivery date. I did do scheduling backward from the delivery date, similar to the way master planning would do that. And so I executed the scheduling for all 16 of these orders at the same time. And so the system went in and it scheduled backward from delivery date as best it could. And for these later delivery dates, the bottom 8 orders, it scheduled essentially exactly what we would have expected. The 2 1,000-pound orders are scheduled to the 1,000-pound mixers. The 500-pound orders, which are actually at right here, these 2 longer ones here, because they were much larger quantity, it's scheduled. This one is the 500-pound low, so it took up the entire time for the lower capacity mixer that's 500 pounds. And then the one right below it that's almost as large took up the other 500-pound mixer. And then the 3 in the middle are the lows. That said, when we jump up to the top for the orders with the earlier delivery date, because it went backwards and it was scheduling these at the same time, we ended up with some of our 500 and 250-pound orders being scheduled to the larger mixers because that's what it took to fulfill the capacity. So in going backwards, it prioritized that. So here again, these 2 in the middle these two in the middle that start right at the delivery date, those are the two 1,000-pound orders with the earlier delivery date. And so it scheduled those first for the 1,000-pound mixers because those are the only ones that can meet that capability. And then for the orders that had lighter weights, it used whatever was available. And so we ended up with a 250. This order is a 250 that was on a 500-pound mixer. This is a 250 that's actually on the 1,000-pound mixer. And then these two top orders for 500 pounds are both on the 1,000-pound mixer. And so that's what the system ended up doing to be able to meet the demand in scheduling backwards, and then also just leveraging those priorities with the capabilities. Here's another screenshot of the capabilities by individual resource. And again, you can see it's a little bit more visible on the previous screen, how it's using the different resources for the different sizes of material, but it is trying to use all of its capability. It's taking the finite capacity into consideration and planning backwards to use all of the resources as best as it can. So that's how we can leverage our resource capabilities to use for scheduling when you've got these similar but not identical machines. And the last scenario, there's actually two scenarios within that. So that has to do with resource changeovers. And there's two options in D365 to deal with resource changeovers. One of them is to use, if you've got a fixed schedule. So if you're always going to have either the equipment or human resources with certain skills, or maybe both of those things, if that's always going to happen at some point during the week, then you can use the property field and work through the calendar to schedule changeovers accordingly. And so if you were to set that up, so the scenario that we'll see in a minute for the fixed schedule, I have a certain piece of equipment basically gets changed out. So they have a shift of workers that would work on Monday through Thursday, and then they execute a changeover Thursday night, and a shift of workers that work on Friday and Saturday rather, with the alternate equipment to run the certain materials that have to run with that alternate equipment on this same machine. And so we're going to do that through the property. When you use property for that fixed schedule, then you use that calendar. So you assign the property to the calendar, and then that calendar to the resource. So that's how it's tied to the resource. And then you would assign the property to an item, and then you can actually have it default from the item, but then you can override anything directly on the route. So what I'm going to show later is where I've identified it specifically on the route. This can be used for both BOMs and formulas. So both discrete and process manufacturing can leverage the property field for a fixed changeover. The other option is to actually use for a more variable schedule. So you don't necessarily know that you need to change over, every Thursday night to run your different equipment on Friday, Saturday for my previous scenario. And I believe in the Microsoft documentation, they typically use a paint example where they always use like the red paint on Monday or something like that. And so maybe you don't know that. You don't know exactly what day it needs to be. And maybe it depends on demand, because maybe the demand is going to fluctuate for the items that need this other piece of equipment that you have to change over to. That's been what I've experienced mostly in my manufacturing experience before I was with Dynamics. We definitely didn't have a fixed notion of when we needed to change the machine over. It was definitely driven by demand. In that scenario, if you're using formulas, then you actually can leverage sequencing. And so you assign your resource the sequence ID, you assign an item the sequence ID. Then there's also some additional sequence configuration that you have to do in the master planning module to make all that work together. So we're going to take a look at that scenario. We're actually going to use some of the Microsoft demo data to show how the sequencing would work. But in the scenarios where I've used it in the past, I actually have not used a two sequence group like the demo data that we're going to look at. I've actually just used a single sequence to recognize when we needed to switch over to this alternate piece of equipment. So I had a particular sequence for that piece of equipment, and the two different values that identified material that ran with one and material that ran with the other, and let the sequencing identify when we would need to change over to run with the alternate piece of equipment. So we're going to take a look at that. And again, this only applies for planned batch orders. So in order to leverage sequencing, you do have to use formulas and you do have to use master planning. And so that's the piece with sequencing. It's not as versatile as property in being able to handle it with just regular production orders. You don't even have to use planning, and BOMs and formulas will work. So we'll take a look at properties first. Okay, so we're taking a look here, and so I'm showing you the working times for this calendar. So I have set up on the 10-hour calendar. I have set up Monday through Thursday to be just a normal 10-hour calendar. And then on Friday and Saturday, I have set up this property that I'm just calling head B. So basically, you know, the normal, this piece of equipment that's called the head on the machine, the normal one is running Monday through Thursday, and then on Friday and Saturday we run head B. And so that's the property that we'll be using for our calendar. So you see it assigned here. I have a yellow arrow pointing to the efficiency, because I did want to point out that if you needed to change the efficiency that's associated with that calendar because of that, you actually could. So that's another thing. Maybe the changeover actually reduces the efficiency of your machine. And so if that's the case, then I'm just pointing out that you could also account for that in the calendar, if that were something that happened because of the changeover. So yellow meaning it's not a required setup. The red arrow is required. We do, if we are going to leverage the property field, then we do have to assign it to the calendar on each of the days or times, right? So I could have assigned the property only from 7:30 to 12 and not from 12:30 to 6. But in my scenario, it's going to be applicable for all of the times on Friday and all of the times on Saturday. So I've assigned the property to both of those. Okay. Then on the route, so I mentioned earlier, you could actually assign this on the item and you could have that default in from the item, but you can assign it directly on the route. And so maybe you have, for whatever reason, different routes for that item and it doesn't always use the alternate. And so here on the general, so you on the particular operation where it's needed, on the general tab for that operation, that is where you specify the property. So, and that's what it takes to be able to use that calendar. The last piece, you do have to account for finite property on the resource. So again, I've got my yellow and red arrows. Yellow meaning finite capacity is not required. You can use infinite capacity, and then the properties. So in my scenario where I've got Monday through Thursday where I'm not using my property, and Friday and Saturday where I'm using my other property, then if you had no finite capacity, then it would just bunch up all the orders on Monday and then bunch up all the orders on Friday based on the property. To me, it doesn't seem like that gives you as much use for your scheduling, but you don't have to use finite capacity to use finite property. It will segregate the calendar piece of it anyway with the finite property. So if you have orders that tend to take up, roughly a day, then and you have different properties for each day of the week, well, then maybe you don't need finite capacity because the finite property is going to go ahead and split it up between the days of the week. But you do have to use this finite property tag on this toggle rather on the resource in order to use that when you're scheduling that resource on against a route that has the same property. So. And then again, back to the job scheduling form. The finite capacity toggle is not required, similar to being that on the resource, but the finite property toggle would have to be on in order for this to work. And then I'm just showing you an example where I had scheduled this these two items. The PW item is actually got the head B property, and the P4000 without the W did not. And so when I scheduled those both with a delivery date, this actually scheduled forward from the 17th back when I ran this, and we see that it went ahead and scheduled my my regular P4000 item, which is that's batch 37. It scheduled that for the 18th and 19th. Those were a Tuesday and Wednesday. And then it scheduled the batch 39, which was the PW item that had the property. It had that starting on Friday, July 21st, which was the first date after I ran the scheduling that had that property. So when we go into the system at the end of the slide deck, I'm going to show you, I'm actually going to reschedule that, and I'm going to do backward from the delivery date. And you'll see that it will leverage that property field regardless of finite capacity. It will schedule my item for the head B on a Friday, Saturday, backward from the delivery date, and then it will schedule the other item on a Monday through Thursday, backward from the delivery date. Now, the last setup would be if I were going to use a variable and I didn't have a fixed calendar. So the first piece is the master planning setup. And if you are in the master planning module, it's in the setup sequencing. And so you've got your different pieces. What I'm showing you on the screen is the sequences themselves. And so there's two sequences in the Microsoft demo data, color and package. So we've got color and then the rank, which basically the rank, so the colors are white, red, and black. And that's the rank in which it would want to schedule it. So it was always going to want to schedule white first, then red, then black. So lower is going to get scheduled first. And then the package, gallon and quart. So it's always going to try and schedule the gallon first and then the quart, based on the way these two sequences are set up. And of course, if you're thinking about paint, then that sequence totally would make sense. You would want to go from the lighter color to the darker color. I've worked in other projects where this would also be very useful. It was involving like medication and processing medication, where it was the same medication of varying strengths. And so you might want to set up a sequence of increasing strength, because you would want to start with the lowest strength and increase your strength as you went up, similar to this darkening of the colors. So that's the sequences themselves, color and package. Then we get the sequence group. So this is when we set up, okay, so both color and package are going to be involved in this. How should the system deal with this? Well, when I look at my sequence group, here are my two sequences, color and package. Color has a rank of 0, package a rank of 1. Therefore, color is going to get prioritized first before package. So if I think back to what we just saw, color went from white to red to black, and package went from gallon to quart. And so what I would expect is that I'm going to have white gallons and then white quarts, and then red gallons and then red quarts, and then black gallons and then black quarts. That's the order that I would expect to see my material scheduled. And then the item, the sequence item, that's simply where you assign items to the different sequences. So here, the P3000 through P3005 items, they've been assigned both a color. So you've got the color sequence assignment to that item and the package sequence assignment to those items. So again, when I've leveraged this in the past, I didn't have two sequences in my sequence group. It was just a single sequence for a piece of equipment that required being changed over. And so I just had to assign the two different values for that piece of equipment to my items, and just a single sequence ID. When I get into my resource, you do have to identify on the resource that it's going to use the sequence group. So, and if it's more than one resource, then you identify it on each of the resources that will be involved. But so this sequence, the 2101 filler, has been identified with the sequence group ID. So that means that when it goes to schedule it, it will consider the sequences. And then on the item, you do have to, that's where you actually usually assign the sequence value. Now, the earlier slide, which had the sequence item from the master planning module, it just shows you a list of all the items that have been assigned to sequences. From the item itself on the plan tab, that's where you typically would assign it to the specific sequence value. So we see that this particular item, the P3000, is assigned to white and gallon. And then this is what happened when there was some demand in the system for the various items and over a period of time. And we ran the master planning, and this was the sequence planned orders that were developed. And what we end up seeing is for that period of time, we've got 3 orders for white gallons, then white quarts, then red gallons, then red quarts, black gallons, black quart. Exactly the way we would have expected it based on the priorities that were assigned to the sequence values. So, and again, I'll go in the system and point out some other pieces to this, but I did want to point out, if you're going to leverage sequencing, that if you are using something that could run on multiple machines, then you might not see, as clear-cut results, but I can attest to the fact that the sequencing does in fact work. So an example where I've used it, because there's 3 machines that have similar capabilities. So I'm actually leveraging both capabilities and sequencing together. They have 3 machines with similar capabilities, and one of those machines, they change over to a different piece of equipment when demand requires it. And so the sequencing is being used for just that resource. And some of the items that can run with the original piece of equipment can run on the other 2 machines. But the items that have to use the additional piece of equipment can only run on the one machine when it's been changed over. And so by leveraging both capabilities and sequencing, I have the system preparing for when they need to do that changeover. It's not as clear cut as this example with the white, red, black, and gallon quarts, because all of that is being sequenced to a single machine. And that's the only thing that it's running. But it is working, and it is identifying based on the demand when the changeover to the other piece of equipment needs to occur. So, okay. So those are the scenarios. Let's take a look in the system real quick. So first off, I'm going to here's my item. I've got 2 orders for this item. Let's take a look at the route. I actually have this 2 different routes for this item. So this is my primary and secondary. Notice it's inherited my runtime and my process quantity. For this route, I actually have a resource load of requiring 2. So this was a larger quantity, and when it's above a threshold of that quantity, it actually is going to require 2 human resources for my secondary. Versus this smaller order, on that route, the secondary is only going to require a single resource. So just to identify that if you are leveraging the primary and secondary, a reminder that you can use the resource load field if you need to use multiple. Typically, it's not multiple machine resources. Normally, that's multiple human resources, but you can use that load. So I'm going to go ahead and schedule. I'm just going to run everything. I'm just going to set that as my default for now, and the toggles for finite property is not really relevant for this one, but we'll take a look. So now I'm going to go back in, and I'm going to look at my Gantt chart. And from the Gantt chart, I can see, that my mixer. Let me actually change my time scale real quick, so that I maybe look at every 4 days, so that we have a little bit. There we go. So now I can see the entire order. So I've got my 2 different orders, and So here's obviously the larger quantity is the one that's being run first, and then the smaller quantity second. So the larger quantity was requiring 2 human resources, and here I see 2 human resources assigned with that larger quantity order, and then a single human resource assigned to work with the smaller quantity order. So just again, showing you that it's going to schedule accordingly, both your primary and secondary resource. And then a reminder as well, one last thing to look at on that route is that I do have a different route group. So may have to bring that into the screen real quick. But I have leveraged a different route group so that my secondary one doesn't require, is not bringing in any costs. So I'll pull that over here. And so my primary is using the standard route group, and there's costs associated with that. My secondary route group has no cost. If I show you that route group, you can see where, you know, we've turned off any estimation for and any costing. So with these toggles turned off on the route group, you will not get any cost associated with that particular operation. Okay, for primary and secondary. All right, moving on to my items. So let me actually also bring in my name, because that will make this more visible. And we're going to drag that over to the left. All right. Okay, so if you see here, I've got all these orders for my different materials, the 1,000 high, medium, low. Those are my viscosities and my pounds. So I'm going to go ahead and schedule all of these. And my primary, notice that's set to priority. That is defaulting in from the scheduling parameters that I'm looking at the priority. So it is going to consider that when it schedules. While it's running, we'll go ahead and duplicate my screen. In the interest of time, okay, well, it's finished. In the interest of time, for the last scenario, I'm going to show you the setups, but I'm not going to re-execute master planning, simply so you can, because, you know, it takes a minute. So, but I'll show you the results and how you would view those. So I'm going to go back into my Gantt chart. And so here, this is the resource view. So this is my 500-pound mixer, and this is one of the 250s. This is another 500 of the other 500 pounds. It's not as clear from this Gantt chart because I can't see the item here, and I certainly have not memorized which batch order goes with which of these. So I'm going to switch this to the order view where it's more visible. So this was the image that was in the presentation, so I won't go through all of them, but these top ones. So again, if these, I'm going to also change my time scale real quick back to 1 day. And I also don't want it to start. And so start there, and we'll end there. Okay, so this we can see, oh, that one actually got pushed out. So rerun from the last time I ran it to put the presentation in there. So apparently, because this is a little bit later, we didn't have enough capacity. So this got pushed out past the delivery date. But it is being scheduled on the regular 500-pound resource. Okay, so here we get our 250-pound resource that is scheduling to the 1,000-pound mixer. So the 3106 is a 1,000-pound mixer. So let me start with the 1,000 pounds, and you can see it does start with those first to meet the capacity. it's going to go ahead and schedule backwards from the delivery date to meet those capacities on the 1,000-pound mixers. And then same thing down here. It schedules those 1,000-pound mixers first, and then it's going to go backwards to meet the others. So here, actually, let me try to bump this up. Yeah, so if we were to expand that and give it a little bit more time, what it did is it ran out of capacity because it used the entire time for the 3103, and so that's why these got pushed out a little bit. But earlier, running the schedule a day earlier to put that screenshot into the presentation, you saw that it actually scheduled. So go look back at the presentation and scheduled those 2 orders for earlier on the 1,000-pound machines, because if we'd started early enough, we would have had enough capacity to fit that in behind the ones that ran for the 1,000-pound items. So but you can use that to identify. It does, in fact, take that into consideration. It's going to schedule backwards from the delivery date, and then it's going to prioritize based on the priorities that you set against the different capabilities. I did want to point out, I mentioned this, that I was going to look at these. So if I go look at my other 2 capabilities, where are my prototypes? So it's going to look in my resources, resource capabilities. Here are my mixes. So this was the one that was in the presentation with the smaller mixers being priority 1. If I look at my 500, you see that there's only 4. These 2, the 3103 and 3104, are the 500-pound mixers with the higher priority. And then the mix at 1,000 just has the 2 1,000-pound mixers with their various levels. Going back, the last 2 orders to look at, this was the PW 4000, which has a property, the head B property. If we look at that on the route, and then the one below it, the P4000. So there's my head B property, which was originally assigned on the general tab of the route. Now I'm just looking at the production route, and this P4000 does not have the head B property. They have a delivery date of the 17th. So I'm going to schedule backwards from the delivery date, and what I would expect, since that's the 17th is next Thursday, I believe, that I should get the order that can be run not on head B should be backwards from that 17th, and then the head B would be scheduled for this Friday in order to meet that delivery date. So here's the order that does not require head B, and it's directly backwards from the 17th because that's Thursday, and Monday through Thursday does not have the property of head B. And here is the PW 4000 order, the one that does require the head B. And even though the delivery date's the 17th, because that's a Thursday, it has to start on this Friday where it has the property. Actually, that's the Saturday, excuse me. But Friday and Saturday are the only 2 days in the calendar that have that head B property. And so it's actually going backwards. And in fact, you can look and see the 10-hour calendar ends at 6 p.m. So it is actually scheduling backwards from Saturday at 6 p.m. to meet that demand for that item with the head B. Okay. And then the last piece, I'm not going to rerun master planning, but just so you're aware, in master planning, if you set up your master plan accordingly to use the sequencing, then when you are finished running master planning, then it will have this sequence planned orders populated. So this is where you would see the sequence planned orders. You can change the way that these are grouped into what's called a campaign. There's some options for that. So I will point that out on the master plan, that's an option. So it's on the sequencing fast tab in the master plan. If you have this turned on, the toggle turned on to sequence planned orders, that's when it's going to go ahead and generate that sequence planned orders inquiry that I just showed you. If you do bucket type of period, then it's actually going to rely on the period that's assigned in the coverage code for the items, and then the number of buckets in the campaign. And so it's just kind of eyeballing how many different campaigns it should set up, or excuse me, how many different orders it should try to execute within a single campaign. And you actually can see if you're not getting it to run in the period that you would want it to, you can actually have another option of doing a calendar, and then you can have day, and then this would be actually the number of days that it tries to execute the campaigns within for the sequences. So this is something I would point out, that if you're working with sequencing, you're going to want to take these parameters here and test with them to identify which one's giving you the most reasonable set of sequenced orders. And to what I mentioned earlier, if you do have more than just one machine that can meet your needs for that, and only one of them requires the sequencing, the results are not quite as clear cut as with the demo data, but it does actually meet the need of recognizing when to switch over with the demand. You just may have to alter these settings to identify what the right blend is for getting the difference between the switchovers. So I was using something where I did calendar, day, and 14 to get more of like a 2-week cycle. But the period, if you've got the period set in your, that's going to be based on the period length in your coverage group, as opposed to the calendar. All right, so let's navigate back to wrap things up. Just some final thoughts. As mentioned previously, leverage your route groups if you need to, if you've got conflicting requirements between capacity and costs. So if you have a need to have capacity for both humans and resources, but you only need to cost for one, or vice versa. If you have a need to cost for both, but you don't need to schedule capacity, you think about those route groups and how to use those. Another thing to think about, if the sequencing functionality is something that you would strongly benefit from, then consider using a formula instead of a BOM. You can certainly use a formula to meet the same requirements that a BOM does. In most scenarios, it's going to behave exactly the way you need it to. You just won't need all of the other formula functionality. That is definitely something I've seen in multiple past projects where we just ended up using the formula instead of the BOM because of the additional functionality that's available with the formula. And the last final thought, as I've run into this in past projects as well, and I'm sure if you've been in Dynamics for a while, then you've had the wonderful, scheduling failed due to timeout, or scheduling failed, not enough capacity, that not enough capacity error that we've all seen. You can cause more issues with scheduling if you have a route that is too complex. And some of the things that Microsoft actually recommends that you don't do: calendars with a lot of breaks in them. So I showed you the 10-hour calendar had like a single break for 30 minutes. But if you try to schedule in, 5 different breaks throughout the day from start to finish for every time somebody walks away from the machine, that can cause problems with scheduling. If you leverage the resource loads in a more complicated route, and if it's a fairly simple route, that may not be that big a deal, but when you start to bring a resource load in, that can also lead to scheduling issues. I have used them successfully in multiple past projects, but you can't have a super complex route along with a lot of different resource loads. You'll start to end up with some scheduling issues. And then using secondary resources in conjunction with either of the above. So while these things secondary resources and resource loads, those can certainly help you with meeting some of the things that you need. And we certainly talked about secondary resources being valuable for scheduling machines and humans. You don't want to make your route so complex that it just can't get scheduled. There's a link in this presentation. This is actually to some Microsoft documentation about exactly which things cause the most problems for the scheduling engine. So this tips to improve scheduling engine performance are some thoughts and ideas from Microsoft about keeping your scheduling nice and clean. So I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for your time. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me at the contact information that's shown at the bottom of the screen.